The science of designing cores in a bowling ball to maximize hook potential has certainly evolved over the past 3 decades. But what's the industry standard for measuring it? The first way is by determining the ball's radius of gyration, or RG.
RG stands for radius of gyration. All that is a big scary engineering term for how hard it is to spin something. It's also a measure of how hard it is for the lane to rev the ball up. So that's why a higher RG is harder for the lane to rev the ball up, so they go longer. A low RG ball is easier for the lane to rev up, so they finish sooner. So to measure the RG of a bowling ball, we use what's called an RG swing. You load a ball into a cradle that's suspended by a wire. You twist that wire puts torque back on the system, which is going to cause the system to oscillate out. Now, essentially what it does is it measures the period of that pendulum, and the harder the ball is to rotate, longer period, higher RG, shorter period, lower RG.
Another way of measuring the core is to look at differential RG.
Differential RG is simply the maximum difference between the lowest RG we can find on the ball and the maximum RG we can find on the ball.
The USBC has set specs on RG, differential RG, and other core characteristics.
RG specification was once 2.43 on the low end and 2.8 on the high end. Today it's still 2.8 on the high end, but the low end was raised to 2.46. Total differential was once 80 diff, and again, we reduced that down to 60 diff.
The reason these characteristics allow for more hook potential is due to the phenomenon of flare.
It's just a natural phenomenon of once the bowler releases the ball kind of takes over and decides, I don't want to spin about the axis you started me around. I want to go to my own preferred axis. And so it's just natural motion of the ball. Instead of having one oil ring on the ball, it keeps flaring and you get different oil rings on the ball. The ball will come back with a track that could be a couple inches wide. And you have an oil ring separated every quarter inch. The more the differential, the larger the separation between it.
Back in July 2015, the USBC Equipment Specifications and Certifications team began 2 years of studies to help better understand the impact of RG and differential RG on bowling ball performance. First, the team discovered that the hook potential of a bowling ball increased as the differential RG increased.
So I think initially you saw a pretty steady increase from 0 to 10 to 20 differential. And then you kind of had a flattening out from about 30 to 50 diff. But once we got above 50 diff, it started to go up again. So at 60 and 70, we started to see the amount of hook increase.
When both the RG and differential RG were varied, the balls with higher differential RG hooked the most, while balls with lower differential RG hooked the least, regardless of their RG levels.
I don't think a lot of people would openly say 30 hooks as much as 60, so that was definitely surprising to see that.
But when one of the higher RG balls yielded more hook than a lower RG ball at the same 0.0 differential RG, additional tests were conducted to determine the true impact of RG on a bowler's RPM rate.
The biggest difference we saw in someone was almost 40 RPM different between their low and their high RPM, which is a big difference. And yeah, it was pretty cool to find that physics says yes, theoretically this is easier to rotate, and the data says yes, bowlers get more revs.
The test proved the RG of the ball does alter the RPM rate a bowler can impart on the ball, and a mathematical model was developed to map the impact different RG values have on a bowler's RPM.
We determined that a bowler that throws a 2.5 RG ball at 300 RPM, if he throws the super low RG, he can get up to 305 RPMs, pick up 5. But if he throws like a 3-piece core, he'll only get 268.
The next test phase was to repeat the previous test, but vary the RPM rate as the RG of the ball was changed.
The physics has always predicted that a higher RG ball will have more angle on the back end and hook more than a low RG ball.
What we found from our study between differential and RG and everything, the total, if you went from a 0 differential ball, non-flaring, those would hook about 12 inches, 12 boards, where the high performance ball would hook about 18, so about 6 boards difference between a non-flaring ball and the super giant.
Another way to look at the results is to compare the average ball paths of each of the different bowling ball combinations.
For most of our tests, we threw an Earl, the throwbot, and we used the Bolt system, which is the camera system to measure the ball paths.
On first glance, a 3-board difference in hook may not seem like a lot on a lane with 39 boards. But when you start to look at it within the context of how a typical ball path is projected during your usual bowling league, 3 boards of additional hook takes on a much larger significance. Another important discovery was that in every case, it was also true that the balls with a higher differential RG created the most entry angle, which is one of the most important components of determining strike percentage, and by extension, scoring.
If you put the ball 2.5 inches, you hit the 17.5 board, you will strike. I mean, 100% times. Okay, 99.9% times. I mean, but it's ridiculous. It will strike forever. You get another ½ inch light, and now your strike percentage drops off, and you actually get to a zone where it's 50% strikes, 50% 10 pins. And as you get even lighter than that, another inch lighter, the strike percentage goes back up again. So you basically have 2 strike pockets down there.
The next test phase looked at changing the oil pattern from a flat 1-to-1 ratio to a typical house shot, which is closer to a 10-to-1 ratio.
House condition just brought all the balls closer together. Obviously, you throw the non-hooking ball, you throw it more in the dry, and it hooks more. The other balls you throw more in the oil, they hook less. So,
considering that the 2008 ball motion study conducted by USBC clearly stated that RG was a more dominant factor than differential RG, it was surprising to find that differential RG is actually the more significant factor on a ball's ability to hook. When RPM rate is linked to the RG of the bowling ball used, the differential RG turns out to be the more significant factor on a ball's ability to hook.